Welcome back to part 2 of this nitro finishing tutorial. In part 1, I explained what supplies are needed for a nitro finish and how to prepare your work for the actual nitro spraying process. Now I'm going to assume that you followed all of the steps in part 1 and that the body or neck you're about to finish is completely smooth and free of any imperfections. Again, if the surfaces of what it is you're about to finish aren't completely perfect, it's going to be quite difficult to create a perfect finish. Now in this second part of this tutorial, I'm going to show you the steps involved in the actual spraying process. But before I do that, I'm going to say a few things about spraying conditions and spraying technique. As I mentioned in part 1 of this tutorial, I want to show you how to create a perfect finish at home without using any specialist tools. That's why I'm going to assume that you don't have access to a spray booth or anything like that. And in that case, it's going to be quite important to make sure that the conditions in whatever space you're going to be spraying the nitro are appropriate for the job. Now, I'm definitely not going to be able to cover everything there is to say about creating a perfect spraying environment in this video. And since you're probably going to be spraying somewhere around the house, it wouldn't be of much use anyway. Instead, I'm going to cover only the most important things to consider when spraying nitro. The first thing you want to look out for is temperature. Ideally, you're going to want to aim for room temperature, so around 21 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If the area is too cold, the nitro won't flow very well, which can cause orange peel. In case you're not familiar with that term, orange peel refers to a textured finish which kind of resembles the skin of an orange. This is something you want to avoid since you're going to have to sand a lot of the finish down to get rid of that texture, wasting a lot of nitro and creating a lot of extra work. Now if your spraying environment is too hot, the nitro can dry too fast, also causing orange peel. A few degrees above or below room temperature isn't going to ruin your finish, but try not to spray nitro in extremely low or high temperatures. The next thing you want to look out for is humidity. This can quite easily be measured with a simple humidity indicator. You want to aim for a relative humidity of around 50%. If the relative humidity is too low, it can again cause orange peel. If it's too high, it can cause what's called blushing, which is basically moisture trapped inside the finish, and it looks like a white haze. Again, this is something you really want to avoid. Another thing to consider is airflow. Again, since you're probably going to be spraying somewhere around the house, I won't be going over any intricate airflow control systems or anything like that. So in this case, I'm mainly talking about things like wind and drafts. And I'm actually going to keep this quite simple. Just make sure there isn't any significant airflow in the space you're going to be spraying, which could blow dust or dirt onto your work, or which could disrupt the spray pattern coming from your spray cans. Also, make sure that the space does offer some kind of ventilation. Last but not least, you obviously don't want to be spraying in an extremely dusty or dirty environment, since even small specks of dust can be visible in a high gloss finish. So taking all of these things into account, you can start looking for a proper space to spray the nitro. Since nitro is quite toxic, I personally recommend not spraying inside your house, unless it's absolutely necessary. In that case, wear a mask and make sure you provide the proper ventilation and that any children, pets, or other people won't be able to inhale the nitro. In any case, it's probably better to spray the nitro in a garage or a shed, or if necessary, even outside. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be doing the spraying in this shed. It offers the proper amount of ventilation, it's dry, and even though it might not look like it, it's relatively clean and dust-free. And even though it might not look like much, I will show you that even in a simple shed like this one, you can create very nice finishes. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about spraying technique. Now, since we're using spray cans, I'm going to keep this fairly simple. The first thing you want to make sure is that you keep the can upright at all times. If you neglect to do this, your spray pattern will be uneven and the paint might even splatter and create a big mess on your finish. To be able to keep the spray can upright at all times, it's very important to determine how you're going to position your work. Depending on the object you're finishing, it can be quite difficult to find a proper way of setting it up so that you can access all parts from a convenient angle. Now, I've seen many different ways of positioning a body or neck for finishing, ranging from hanging it on a string or a hook, to laying it down flat on a table and flipping it over to finish each side. I'd say use whatever method you like. However, I like to be able to manipulate the orientation of the body or neck while I'm spraying. So for bodies, I'll use these self-made handles that attach to the neck pocket or tremolo cavity depending on what type of body it is I'm finishing. I make them out of scrap pieces of wood, and I have several of them for different types of guitars. In this case, I'll fix it to the neck pocket with 3 small screws. It does mean that I had to drill these holes in the neck pocket. Several major guitar manufacturers use a similar method, so you might find some smaller holes in Fender neck pockets, for example, as well. Of course, if you don't want to drill any holes, there are plenty of other methods available. If you do decide to go with this method, be sure the handle doesn't touch any of the edges of the neck pocket, also at the back. If you don't take this into account, the nitro will bridge from the body to the handle, resulting in the finish being damaged when removing it. Now, when you start spraying, you want to keep an eye on the way you move your hand around. In general, you want to move in straight lines, parallel to the surface, at a distance of 8 to 10 inches or 20 to 25 centimeters. Some people will be tempted to flick their wrist when spraying, but by doing that, you'll actually vary the distance and angle from the nozzle to the surface, creating a thicker coverage in the center of your work and poor coverage on the sides. So try to move your hand in a straight line, parallel to the surface. Obviously, when you're working on curved surfaces, you should try to follow the contours of the surface so that the distance from the nozzle to the surface stays approximately the same. This can be a little tricky when working on highly curved parts such as cutaways, but with some practice it shouldn't be a problem. Don't start spraying directly over your work. Quite often when you start spraying, some larger droplets will exit the nozzle, and you don't want those on your work. So, for example, if you're spraying from left to right, start spraying just to the left side of your work and stop spraying just beyond the right side of your work. That way you'll have a nice clean spray pattern every time. Last but not least, you want your passes to overlap to some extent. I like to overlap each pass by about 50%, but it depends somewhat on the nozzle on your spray can and the spraying distance. You can experiment to find out what works well for you. The spraying process itself is quite simple. I'll start with a few coats of sanding sealer, followed by primer, color, and clear coat. Along the way, I will explain what each coat is for and how to apply it. The number of coats you'll need really depends on your skill and experience level. An experienced person with professional equipment will obviously be able to do the job with a smaller total number of coats than a beginner. I personally like to apply 2 to 3 coats of sealer and primer, followed by 3 to 4 coats of color and 4 to 6 coats of clear. The exact number of coats I'll spray depends mostly on the quality of my spraying job. Hence, these amounts are not fixed figures and depend greatly on your skill level. Your main concern here is the amount of sanding that will be required to get things completely flat before buffing. If you applied a very small number of coats, but there are still many imperfections to sand out, chances are you're going to sand through the finish at some point. If your finish is absolutely perfect, it will require only a minimal amount of sanding, meaning that you'll be able to get away with a very small number of coats. The first step in the spraying process is applying sanding sealer. Sealer is usually a high-build nitro lacquer, meaning that it has certain solids suspended in the lacquer, allowing it to fill up small imperfections more easily. That means it will help to get rid of any tiny spots that you may have missed in the grain filling process. The sealer will also prevent the wood from absorbing a lot of lacquer, and this is primarily important when working with highly absorbent woods such as poplar or tulip wood. I'll start the process by cleaning the body thoroughly. I first degrease it with mineral spirits, then I'll try to get rid of any dust particles on the surface. For this I use a tack cloth, which is basically a cloth impregnated with beeswax. Dust particles will stick to the wax and you'll be left with a nice dust-free surface. If you're going to be using a tack cloth, just make sure you don't apply pressure when running it along the surface, or you'll just be rubbing beeswax onto your work, and you don't want that. Once the body is clean and dust-free, I'll start applying the sealer. Needless to say, you should shake the can for about 2 minutes before use to properly mix all of the components. Also, don't forget to put on your mask at this point. Whenever I start applying lacquer, I like to start with a very light coat. Just resist the temptation to create a perfect coverage right away. I'll wait about 20 minutes before applying the next coat. The second coat can be a bit thicker than the first one. Still, I'd recommend keeping the coats on the thin side. It's better to apply a coat that's a little bit too thin than applying a very thick coat and getting runs in your finish. The spraying itself is quite straightforward. Just try to get an even coverage while applying the previously mentioned spraying techniques. Try to pay extra attention to any sharp corners or roundovers, since these will usually collect less lacquer and are thus easier to sand through when sanding and buffing the finish later. After about 20 minutes, the coat will be dry to the touch, and I'll inspect it to see if I'm happy with the result. Be aware that the nitro is still very soft at this stage and it's easily damaged, so be careful. What I'm looking for when inspecting my work are any significant dust or dirt particles that might have made their way into the lacquer. I'm also looking for drips or runs or any parts that are generally quite rough. If any of these are present, I will sand them out and apply subsequent coats until I'm happy with the result. If sanding is necessary, sand out any imperfections with some 400 grit sandpaper and thoroughly clean your work with mineral spirits or naphtha afterwards before moving on to the next coat. One important thing to know about nitro is that any subsequent coat will dissolve into a previous coat. Because of that, unless the previously mentioned dust or drips or anything like that are present, it's usually not necessary to sand your work in between coats. The only time I will sand in between coats is if the surface is very rough and shows a lot of orange peel, for example. If that's not the case, you're fine moving on to the next step. So now that we've applied the sealer coats, it's time to apply primer. Nitro primer is frequently offered in different colors. I like to use a white primer for lighter colors and a gray primer for darker colors. In this case, I'll be using a white primer. Now, in my opinion, a primer coat really isn't absolutely necessary. The color coat would bond with the sealer without any problems whatsoever. And when I spray a natural finish, I'll go straight to the clear coat after spraying the sealer. The reason why I still like to spray a couple light coats of primer is because the solid white or gray color allows me to very easily spot any imperfections that I might have missed earlier. This way I know that I've created a perfect foundation for the color and clear coat. Again, I'll start by applying a very thin coat. And when I'm happy with that, I'll let it dry for 20 minutes. And then I'll come back and apply a thicker second coat. After about 20 minutes, I'll inspect it and decide whether or not it needs any sanding and possibly a third coat. And once I'm happy with the results, I'll let it dry for about an hour and I'll move on to the color coat. Now, the process of applying the color and clear coat is basically no different than applying the sealer or a primer. I'll again start with a light coat first, and then I'll apply 3 to 4 coats of color. Again, with about 20 minutes of drying time in between coats. The last coat of color should be absolutely perfect, as any visible dust particles will remain visible. If I do get any dust particles in my color coat, I'll stop spraying right away and I'll let it dry for about an hour. Then I'll come back and very carefully sand it out using 1000 grit sandpaper. Only then I'll continue spraying. This is what my final color coat looks like. And this is about as good as I can get it using spray cans. There's just a tiny bit of orange peel, but this can easily be sanded flat later. So I feel confident moving on to the clear coat. But before I do that, I like to let it dry for at least 24 hours. So a day has passed since I applied the sealer, primer and color coat. So now it's time to apply the clear coat. The clear coat is again applied in the same way as the other coats. I'll apply 4 to 6 coats depending on the quality of the finish and whether or not it requires any sanding in between coats. Generally speaking, each coat of clear should be as perfect as possible, and at this stage even the smallest dust particles should be sanded out before moving on to subsequent coats. Only when I reach the point at which I'm confident that the surface is completely flat and relatively smooth and that it's free of any dust particles or other imperfections, I'll consider the actual spraying process finished. All it needs now is a lot of time to cure. Again, the finish is very soft at this stage, so be very careful when moving your work around. Leave it to cure in a well-ventilated space without any direct sunlight hitting your work. And here's what the body looks like now. To summarize, I've applied 2 coats of sealer, 2 coats of primer, 4 coats of color, and 4 coats of clear nitro. Again, these are not fixed numbers, and I do recommend experimenting a little bit to find out what works best for you. The next step is to sand and polish the finish to get that high gloss look. Before I do this, however, the nitro needs to cure for at least 2 weeks. I personally like to give it a little bit longer, preferably about a month. So if you have any questions about this part of the finishing process, or if you ran into any problems while working on your own project, be sure to leave a comment below, as I am planning on doing a troubleshooting video as well. So join me for part 3 if you want to find out how to sand and polish to create a high gloss finish. And as always, thanks for watching and see you next time.